This week on Pocket Pedagogy, it's Ducks on Ducks on Ducks. In 1991, Carl Barks received the Disney Legends Award in honor of his work bringing Donald Duck and his feathered family to life. It was, of course, a tremendous honor, placing the so-called good duck artist in an illustrious and select category of creatives over the years that includes legendary animator Ub Iwerks, actress and singer Julie Andrews, and more recently, legendary creators like Jim Henson and Jack Kirby. With this 1991 award, Barks' place among those whose major contributions shaped the company's output forever was assured. However, 1991 was also notable for a different, maybe less significant reason: the North American release of the Sega Game Gear. The Game Gear was Sega's answer to Nintendo's Game Boy, boasting a slightly larger backlit display as well as better RAM and processor and a horizontal orientation with more surface space that made it slightly more comfortable than the Game Boy. Internally, it was actually nearly identical to Sega's 8-bit Master System home console, and with an adapter you could actually play games from that system on the handheld. Most games actually got released for both Game Gear and the Master System as a result, including the two games we're going to be talking about this week. So from a technological standpoint, the Game Gear was really a superior platform to the Game Boy, yet Nintendo's machine outsold and outlasted it by orders of magnitude. Blame it perhaps on the device's size, too big to fit neatly into most pockets or backpacks, the lack of a single killer app like Tetris was for Game Boy, or what is probably the ultimate cause of the system's underperformance compared to its underpowered rival, the battery life. Thanks in large part to the gas tube backlights on the Game Gear's screen, the console would drain 6 AA batteries in about 3 to 5 hours, compared to the Game Boy's 14-plus hour battery life with just 4 batteries. Now, serious Game Gear players invested in power adapters for home and in the car, as well as rechargeable battery packs and other accessories, all of which added more expense and made the system less portable. For this and other reasons, my own personal experience with the Game Gear at the time was fairly limited. Thankfully, I just picked up a Game Gear adapter for the Analog Pocket, allowing me to finally play a lot of games on an even better screen that I had missed before with substantially better battery life. This adapter is pretty straightforward. You plug it into the Pocket, you plug the cartridge into the adapter, and you're off to the races. But it does add some bulk to the device that makes it a little bit harder to use and to store, and it blocks off the shoulder buttons. Not that the Game Gear had shoulder buttons, of course, but still, it's a little awkward to hold. It's a functional, if somewhat flawed solution to the problem, but it works, and that's really what I needed it to do. And all of that's good because Sega's track record with Disney games, and Donald Duck in particular, is really exceptional. Sega and Disney were actually really close in the early 90s, maybe even to the point of collaboration outside of video games. But we know for sure that Sega developed or published several Disney games on their hardware throughout the 1990s, more than a few of which featured Donald Duck. Donald co-starred in the second game in the company's signature Disney Illusion series, World of Illusion, and also took the lead role in QuackShot, a terrific Genesis and Mega Drive game that I was very sad to find out did not have a Game Gear version. Otherwise, we'd be playing that one right now. While Capcom's Disney games are arguably the gold standard for the license, and trust me, we will talk about those, Sega's are also no slouch, and which is truly better really kind of depends on your perspective and your own personal fandom. So this week, we will look at the two Game Gear games that featured Donald Duck, 1991's The Lucky Dime Caper starring Donald Duck, and 1993's Deep Duck Trouble starring Donald Duck. We haven't covered two games in a single episode on Pocket Pedagogy before, but these two merit the treatment. They're both games that offer a snapshot of a unique partnership between two iconic entertainment companies, and both are handheld games that, more or less, simultaneously released as comparable console games. The two games are also pretty similar, and one could argue that Deep Duck Trouble is at the very least an intended spiritual sequel to Lucky Dime Caper. So we'll consider them a package deal as we go on with our second installment of... We start with The Lucky Dime Caper starring Donald Duck. This 1991 release casts you as, well, Donald Duck on a quest to rescue his nephews Huey, Dewey, and Louie and retrieve Uncle Scrooge's legendary #1 dime from the evil witch Magica De Spell. Now, one wonders why Scrooge McDuck, canonically one of the world's greatest adventurers, and someone who has dealt with the spell on numerous occasions, leaves this crucial mission up to his perpetually unlucky nephew. The Lucky Dime Caper is a fairly standard platformer. Donald traverses 7 stages across a variety of biomes, ranging from a forest to the pyramids, first rescuing his nephews and then rescuing the lucky dimes that Scrooge had just given them. Each level culminates in a boss battle, with the final confrontation against Magica herself in her castle. Naturally, Donald can jump and even swim, and jumping off of enemies' heads gives him a little bit of a boost. Crucially in this game, he has an actual attack button. By default, Donald swings a giant cartoon hammer that works pretty much how you'd expect it to, but higher level players can actually sort of queue up the hammer's animation to actually hit an enemy on the downward part of a jump. That's a pretty crucial bit of tech that can help a lot in later fights. Later on in the game, you can also pick up a flying disc weapon that not only gives Donald range, but the ability to attack enemies directly above him. That's a pretty significant change, and it makes the game a lot easier in some instances. You can also pick up stars to get extra lives, as well as gems to increase your score. Now, what's also interesting about this game is that it seems to borrow a lot from other popular platformers of the time. For instance, one level has platforms that disappear in patterns, like Mega Man. Also in this game, you can pick from a selection of stages rather than being forced into one standard linear progression, though unlike in Mega Man, the order in which you play them really doesn't confer any real advantage, it's just a nice little thing. Donald even echoes fellow Sega hero Sonic the Hedgehog by getting impatient, yelling at you, and tapping his foot if the player idles too long. He's actually full of personality in this game, and the title is pretty well animated overall. His larger sprite on the screen compared to Go and Quackers not only makes him more personable, it also makes it easier to follow the action, and there are lots of fun contextual animations. For instance, if you get too close to the edge of a platform, Donald will flail wildly to keep his balance. Both of these games are very emblematic of Sega's approach to making Disney software. Sega's Disney games were very colorful, vastly expressive titles with lush visuals and music. That's also the case here. Lucky Dime Caper is a beautiful handheld game for the time, with backgrounds and characters that pop, especially on a modified Game Gear screen or the Analog Pocket. The developers really seem to just get the character, even within the limited context of a platformer of its time. It's not perfect. For instance, there can be a lack of really significant visual feedback when you make contact with an enemy, making some boss fights a bit tougher than they really have to be. But after last week's exercise in tedium and frustration, it was kind of nice to have fun playing one of these games for once. The game's plot ends in a perfectly on-brand twist for the character when Donald learns what the big reward that Scrooge promised him for all of his toil and adversity is: a dime of his own. Deep Duck Trouble really echoes a lot of what its predecessor did as well. This time, Donald is roped into adventure when Scrooge McDuck acquires a cursed amulet that causes him to inflate like a balloon and float around. Once again, Donald sets off on a globe-trotting excursion to find the artifacts necessary to open a shrine, so he can return that amulet to its rightful place and Scrooge to his rightful level of deflation. It's a pretty silly premise, but it feels like something that Barks would have come up with, and I mean that as high praise. Deep Duck Trouble plays very similarly to Lucky Dime Caper, though this time Donald swaps out his hammer for a kick attack in addition to his standard bounce off their heads attack. This kick is not as immediately useful as his offensive capabilities in Lucky Dime Caper, but it does add some unique wrinkles to the gameplay. Kicking a stone or a box will generally send it upward in a diagonal direction, acting as a sort of ersatz projectile. This even figures into some traversal puzzles later, where kicking a box at the right angle into the right location can open up hidden goodies. I still prefer the hammer because the kick has pretty limited range and no real offensive capability on its own, but it's an interesting idea nonetheless. The game also adds some interesting wrinkles to the formula through power-ups. Donald can hold up to 3 hit points, restoring them via food pickups in each stage. An ice cream cone heals for 1, and a roast turkey heals for 3. Now I can see your concern through the screen, and I assure you that for some reason, Donald Duck eating poultry has been a thing for the character's entire existence. It's led to a great deal of consternation and puzzlement among fans. Sort of like how Goofy and Pluto are both dogs, but one can talk and wear pants and the other one doesn't. Don't think too hard about any of it, only madness lies that way. Rather than going with bosses at the end of each level, Trouble instead ends with that level's guardian chasing Donald across a lengthy auto-scrolling stage. These aren't necessarily always the most engaging encounters, and it's very easy to get caught between your pursuer and the terrain, leading to a lot of cheap deaths when you can't always see what's in front of you. But the idea of Donald getting in over his head and running for his life from a cartoon gorilla or a giant shark is at least thematically appropriate. There is an actual final boss battle, but it does feel a little bit out of place for the game when you haven't really had one prior to that point. Thankfully, the boss fight isn't really very difficult once you know the patterns. Visually, Deep Duck Trouble looks better than Lucky Dime Caper, as would befit a studio with the benefit of more time and experience developing for the handheld. Donald's animations, the color palette, and even the backgrounds all look more detailed and fleshed out. Toward the end of the game, paying attention to those more detailed backgrounds is actually mandatory, as the reliefs in the background actually direct you on the route necessary to navigate a waterslide maze puzzle right before the final boss. I am ashamed to say it took me multiple deaths and a very long time before I realized that. That increased visual fidelity does seem to come at a cost though, as the game does perform noticeably worse than its predecessor. There's a lot of slowdown throughout the game, making the platforming a bit more challenging than it has to be at times. Sega farmed out development of this one to Aspect, a development house that they had worked with a lot on the Game Gear and Master System, so it's not quite clear why it's so unoptimized, but compared to the snappier Lucky Dime Caper, it's admittedly disappointing. Donald also feels maybe just a bit too big in this game, making some tight spaces and underwater levels a little bit more difficult to squeeze through. Otherwise, though, it retains the responsive controls and charm of its predecessor, right down to the ending, where Donald rewards himself with a crown for his efforts and ultimately falls victim to the same curse that beset his uncle, ultimately being towed along like a balloon on a string as his family sets off on another adventure to cure him. Like so many of Barks' Donald Duck stories, it's an ironic and amusing twist of fate for the hapless waterfowl, and it did get a pretty good chuckle out of me. So in sum, we have two similar and generally well-made, if not terribly innovative games in front of us this week. So what can we learn from them? Just like Deep Duck Trouble is a spiritual successor to the Lucky Dime Caper, so too is this week's episode a spiritual successor to our previous installment of...
Quack, quack!
Now look, I really hate to keep harping on Going Quackers, but the fact that these two games predate that one by nearly a decade, and both are not only more entertaining games, but also truer to the spirit of what makes Donald Duck and the Barks comics and cartoons so enduring and so endearing, is hard to overlook. More than that, though, these games also illustrate the importance of looking beyond the marquee platforms to find quality titles. Handheld history is not covered to the same degree that console and PC history are to start with. But with the Game Gear's cumbersome qualities and its hilariously short battery life, it means that the system, while it has its loyal fans, doesn't really have the same critical mass of cultural relevance and nostalgia that the Game Boy does. And many of its games are much less likely to be updated or re-released as a result, especially the licensed ones, and there were a lot of licensed Game Gear games. It's an absolute shame, too. Licensed video games, more than perhaps any other kind of video game, are extremely susceptible to falling into obscurity and obsolescence because contracts don't last forever. While a restored and lovingly curated collection of Sega's Disney games across all its platforms would likely be a critical and commercial success, the nature of video game licensing means that even if Sega, Digital Eclipse, or any other company wanted to actually do it, they would need to seek out Disney's approval and negotiate an entirely new deal to use their characters. Now, it's not outside the realm of possibility. Disney's strategy in the gaming space as of late seems to be focused more on licensing out their characters rather than developing the games themselves. This is evidenced by their success in letting studios like Insomniac take the reins on the PlayStation Spider-Man games, as well as their $1.5 billion investment in Epic Games to make Disney experiences that operate within Fortnite. The company has also extended licenses to other re-releases, such as Digital Eclipse's excellent Disney Afternoon Collection and the Disney Classics Aladdin and the Lion King Collection. They even recently worked with developer Empty Clip Studios to remaster the Gargoyles Genesis game. So really, it's probably up to Sega, whose focus as of late seems to be solely on its own marquee properties like Sonic the Hedgehog, Persona, and Like a Dragon, as well as its recent acquisition of Angry Birds developers Rovio, as well as their own forays into transmedia entertainment. It's a little hard to see where the development and promotional costs of re-releasing games they do not own outright would fit into that. And if anyone is the sticking point, I would guess it's probably them. So it once again behooves the video game historian to seek out lesser-known titles and platforms to learn and preserve what we can from them. These two games are not super obscure titles that only saw a limited global release or anything like that, but they certainly aren't reverently mentioned alongside their Disney game contemporaries either. Luckily, we live in a time where it's not terribly difficult to find ways to revisit games like this, and a more dedicated games preservation movement than has ever been seen before exists thanks to organizations like the Video Game History Foundation and the folks working on technological developments like the FPGA system that powers the MiSTer and Analog platforms. And really, that's what Pocket Pedagogy is all about too, putting a spotlight on games that may not always get that spotlight, so hopefully you'll be kinda interested in them too. Like their avian protagonist, these games might be unassuming and even a little rough around the edges. But if you're willing to put in some time and attention, they turn out to be pretty darn lovable. I'm Brian Carr, and thanks for watching Pocket Pedagogy. Next time on Pocket Pedagogy, curse me kilts and bless me bagpipes!